Well, welcome to MAS The Afternoon. It's a nice antidote to the bit of the downer we had this morning about the economy. Now this is all the good news we're giving you. So it'll keep you awake in the afternoon, we hope. I also noticed that in that panel, you probably didn't notice, but the people got up when they talked. They didn't stay in their chairs. So feel free to wander the stage. I'm Mary Rowe, and I'm happy to be part of this entrepreneurial extravaganza that we're having this afternoon. And I'm joined here by three able participants who are going to talk very briefly about their own perspective. The interesting thing about this session, and the title, I'm going to turn to Margaret and ask her why she titled it this way, because it's all her fault. I'm joined by Margaret Anadu from Goldman Sachs, Jeffrey Rosenblum from Acumen Partners, and Jonathan Bowles from the Center for Urban Future. And what's interesting for us here at MAS is that we're all concerned about all these issues, and we're particularly concerned about what the relationship is between the built environment, the things that we experience viscerally, streets and buildings and natural features and all the things, and how that impacts our livability, including our economy. So this session is really going to kind of ground what you just heard the other folks talking about in the panel that follows us, to just talk about how this works in place. How does the economy work in place? So the session is provocatively titled Mixed Income, Mixed Use, Mixed Up. And that was Margaret's title, so I'm going to ask her to start and tell us why she thought we should talk about it that way. Margaret.
As Mary mentioned, I'm Margaret, and I work at Goldman Sachs in the Urban Investment Group, and we've been around for about 10 years, and the purpose of the group is to invest nationwide, but mostly in New York City, in catalytic projects in emerging neighborhoods. And so the bulk of our work has been in New York City, and so much of it has been parts of very large redevelopments or rezonings, or working alongside the city when we're thinking about 30 blocks and very big ideas. And we've noticed over the last few years that we've been missing an opportunity to do something that's even more impactful and almost in a way smaller, and that's using the built environment that we already have. So instead of everything being about new construction, we've invested in a few projects recently that are about taking existing stock, an old warehouse, anything that's underutilized, and use that to do something that's not the classic cookie cutter mixed income housing building with retail on the bottom, but thinking about mixed income and mixed use neighborhoods. So not just I want to live in an apartment building above a subway and be able to go downstairs and buy a quart of milk, but taking a little further and saying, I want to work in this neighborhood, and I want to, not live in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and take the subway to Midtown, but I want to ride my bike to Crown Heights or South Williamsburg. And so the whole idea about mixed income, mixed use, mixed up is we've thought a lot about mixed use buildings, but what can we do about mixed use neighborhoods and actually creating jobs within these neighborhoods that are accessible to the folks that actually live there? We don't have all the answers, and we're early in our thinking, but that was the thought process behind the panel.
Great. Jeffrey, talk to us about your work.
Sure. My company, Acumen Capital Partners, we focus on buying old industrial buildings, typically single tenant of large scale, and we try to multi-tenant them. We're contrarians from the standpoint that a lot of developers have taken these old industrial buildings and created residential projects. We keep them light industrial on very creative type environments. And we also focus out of boroughs in New York City. Don't know if we have a photo.
Jeffrey has a slide, but he doesn't have the pickle, because they'll adapt them for you. Yeah.
This is a project that we bought about 5 years ago from Standard Motor Products, a publicly traded auto parts manufacturer. And the day before we bought the building, you had 1,000 United Auto Workers making all different types of auto parts. Obviously, the plan was the day after we closed, all those jobs, those 1,000 UAW jobs, were going to be relocated down to Mexico. And today, we're into the project, and I'm happy to say we're not fully occupied, but we have over 1,000 people doing other things in this building. And I guess the key to this project was probably a tipping point with two tenancies. Clearly, we had to put in a lot of capital into redesigning it and putting new windows and putting in lobbies and putting in common cores, but we were able to attract the Jim Henson Company, who does the Muppets, and they had a workshop down in the Village, but clearly they were thinking of relocating for several reasons, one being economic, one being that they wanted more light and air, and also their employees, ironically, the majority of the employees actually lived in Brooklyn and Queens, so from a transport standpoint, it made sense. The second probably tipping point tendency in the building, as you can see on there, the roof is green. We had always planned to do a green roof when we bought the building, but we were approached by a group of young folks, a group called Brooklyn Grange, who were looking to do agriculture, and it really aligned with that thought process, and we immediately got them on the building. And today, I'm happy to say, you know, we have 4 beehives on the building. We've got a chicken coop up there. They host one day a week during season, we have a green market, and it enhances our lobby, which we, of course, allow local artists. It's both a gallery space for art as well as food. And I think those two elements of bringing a very well-known creative company and then adding this green component to the building clearly put the building on the map and gave us some very other interesting tenants. And it runs the gamut from, you know, high-end artisan working with furniture, and we have not-for-profit dance troupe, some sound engineers. So that was a very, very typical type of project that we had looked at. This next building here is something that we bought about a year ago. This was the former Pfizer plant. Matter of fact, back in the 1840s, Pfizer started right on these grounds. And obviously, back in 2008, they stopped producing their drugs, and they were looking to sell this asset. We came in and purchased this property. And about, I guess, in January, they finally moved out all of their people, and we moved into the building and set up our offices there. Since the building it's a very large building, this is a 600,000-foot building. The other project was about 300. It gives us very much sense of scale, and we could actually create a community within the community just because of that type of scale. This is, of course, at the fork roads of a lot of communities. You know, even though it's got a Williamsburg zip code, you could go a block or two and you're in Bed-Stuy. You could go a block or two and you're in Bushwick. So it's really not your, what people think of classical Williamsburg on Bedford or the waterfront. It definitely has a very much mixed type of community and people who live there. We were able to attract already since January, we probably have over 40 entrepreneurs who have come into the project. And one segment that we were able to attract was a food segment. And there's a great amount of entrepreneurs in New York who are artisanal food, and people probably have seen them all over at Smorgasbord or whatever. They chose our facility to actually manufacture their product. And one of the biggest reasons was that it was a former FDA-approved facility with Pfizer. They produced Lipitor and Viagra just a couple of years ago. And then, of course, just the classic elements that these old industrial buildings have. The floor loads are unbelievable, and the amount of power that Pfizer put in, and considering that Pfizer was a Fortune 50 company, or still is, they put a lot of money and capital into it. So the elevators and the loading docks are not your classical, dirty, tired industrial building. In addition to the food sector, we've been able to attract a lot of other interesting tendencies. One sector is the science group. We've gotten a group called Atlas Scientific who came, and these are just some young kids who deal in robotics and sensors for robotics, and they sell to NASA. They've even used a science lab of ours that has an autoclave that Pfizer had left behind. We also attracted a not-for-profit science collaborative public lab. And these are just 8 scientists who sit around and share desks, and they kind of mix together. And then we've attracted the arts. So we have some gallery owners there. We have some artisans themselves. And then probably the film category. We've been doing a lot of transient film shoots, set builds, et cetera. So these projects that we do in the boroughs seem to attract a very much creative set and the entrepreneurial set.
Come back tomorrow and you'll hear about the Brooklyn Grange, because Ben Flanner's going to be here. I guess we've gone from Viagra to vegetables. That's the new economy. Do you like that? Okay, Jonathan.
Well, I'm Jonathan Bowles. I run the Center for an Urban Future, which is an independent think tank here in the city, and we write about how to grow and diversify New York's economy and how to expand economic opportunity. So we've written about everything as varied as the air cargo industry and manufacturing in New York to the importance of the design and tech sectors, and we write a lot about things like community colleges and how to build the skills of New York City's population. And you know, I want to pick up on something that Jeff said, and that is that I think that the buildings that Margaret and Jeff are talking about are so important because they weren't converted to residential. You know, it's, you look back a decade ago, you know, there was such a movement to convert buildings in a lot of the neighborhoods that we're talking about now, Crown Heights and Williamsburg and Red Hook and Greenpoint and Sunset Park, and that pressure is still there to some extent, but you know, the kind of things that are growing in New York City's economy right now, creative industries, technology, artisanal manufacturing, these are the kind of things that need the kind of spaces that Jeff has and that Margaret's looking at in places like Crown Heights, and that also, you know, there's some amazing developers, the Greenpoint Manufacturing and Design Center, Greg O'Connell in Red Hook, and Erwin Cohen with what he did in Long Island City and then at Chelsea Market. You know, I was recently talking with someone in the tech sector, and so building on the last panel, and it was really struck by a comment that the last place he would want to move his tech startup was the kind of building that his father would have worked in.
Right.
And you know, it says a lot, and it's not just tech. It's a lot of the creative industries. They want to be in these former industrial buildings. They want to be in Class B and C buildings. They also can't afford to be in a lot of the Class A buildings that have. And so, you know, design jobs in Brooklyn are up about 100% over the last decade. This is growing. Tech is increasingly moving to places like Brooklyn and Queens because Union Square and the Flatiron area, which has the largest concentration of those things, rents are now up at about $60 a square foot. And so these type of properties, these kind of developments are increasingly important. And the same thing goes with light manufacturing. You know, the bad news is that, you know, we're no longer in an age where the big swing line staples are staying in New York. You know, that's been over for a while. But the really exciting thing is that we're in this entrepreneurial manufacturing wave that I think we hadn't seen in a while. There's all these people that want to start manufacturing companies, and they tend to be a lot smaller, but there are a lot of the same companies that Jeff was talking about that are in his building and in buildings like Greenpoint Manufacturing Design. Some of these are companies that really, you know, cross between creative and manufacturing. We found a statistic recently that just in the last 10 years, the average size of a manufacturing company in Brooklyn went from 16 employees on average in 2000 to 10 employees in 2010. You know, and so on one level, you know, that's bad because there's not as many jobs in manufacturing, but there's this entrepreneurial manufacturing wave that I think is really important for Brooklyn and for the whole city. I would just add with one more thing is that, you know, we've got to make sure as a city that we keep these kind of buildings because they are very flexible. They can handle manufacturing. They can handle, you know, artist spaces. They can handle graphic design, architecture, tech. And when the city did the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning several years ago, one of the things that troubled me about that, I thought, you know, well, clearly there's a need for housing in this city, so on the whole, the idea was very sound, but I was really troubled that we didn't preserve enough commercial buildings in that district. Because even if they aren't going to ultimately be used for manufacturing purposes, they could be for all the creative people that live in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. Today, there's really no place for them to actually have a growing tech company or a growing architectural firm in Williamsburg. And so even though tons of tech workers today live in Williamsburg, right, they're all commuting elsewhere for jobs. And so we've got to keep that in mind going forward.
So the panel that follows us is going to be about some of the mechanics of what kinds of jobs we're creating, and I want to take your segue and go back to Margaret. In terms of place, in terms of actually, can we, what is the impact in neighborhoods of retaining these kinds of buildings? Can they be used for this? I love your bit about not where my dad lived, but you actually now want to work where your grandfather worked. That's the building you want to work in now, or your grandmother potentially. Let's talk about the return on investment. You're a hardcore financier, Margaret. You're not alone in this space. How do we get the finance industry to take an interest to help us have the capital to be able to hang on to these buildings and create these kinds of things?
Yeah, so that's a layered question. I think a big part of it is just the types of capital you're going to attract. So when you talk about just pure returns and you know, what equity IRR do you want? So our group is about a lot more than that. Like, we think a lot about the actual double bottom line and what other returns we're getting in terms of reduction in poverty, increases in employment.
This is Goldman Sachs talking.
Genuinely.
Mm-hmm. No, sure. No, it's fine. I just think, I mean, are you alone in that space, or are there?
No. We absolutely not. There are 20 of us in my division, but
I don't mean at Goldman, but I just, you know, your industry is not seen as particularly supportive of this.
No.
So talk to me.
Yeah, there are lots of folks, whether it's the large commercial banks, some portions of the private equity funds that are maybe focused not specifically on it in terms of the revitalization of neighborhoods, but the demographic data is not rocket science. Cities, you know, everything is about cities, returning to cities. It's where people want to live, it's where people want to work. So there is tons of capital flowing into urban dense centers.
So I want you to deal with Jonathan's question. Are you going, this is the title you got at. Yeah. You create an initiative. Does it employ local people? Is it employing the local folks? Are we giving jobs to local folks? Or are they just coming from 4 boroughs away and coming out?
So there are 2 pieces to that. I think one, it's hard to do anything in this work when you're thinking about getting jobs to low-income people that doesn't involve New York City. So, for example, on one of the projects that we're working on in Crown Heights, one of our partners is New York City Economic Development Corp. And there's not, you know, a direct investment in the building, but the types of tenants that Jeff is talking about, who actually are making things and building things, and part of this creative light manufacturing center are the types of tenants that New York City is working with every day to give them a grant to help them get started, to you know, provide the upfront capital so they can sign a lease and get a space. So part of it is just, it has to go back to government. You know, you will just not naturally all of a sudden rehab 4 big buildings and then employ tons of low-income people. There needs to be, you know, an interaction with the government in terms of actual dollars and capital, zoning incentives, all the things that New York City has done incredibly well, I think, on the housing side. So that's a part of it. The other part of it, which is really exciting to us, that's happening more organically, is just the types of businesses that want to be in these neighborhoods. So, and Jeff can probably talk specifically about some of his tenants, but in touring his buildings, you'll see this isn't rocket science labs that could only employ PhDs with 30 years of degree. These are folks who are actually making things. And so there's just a natural connection to, you know, potentially lower skilled populations that could come in to work with these tenants and these businesses and not just be able to add value, but be working for companies that have this progressive mindset where they care about training, and that's part of their mission anyway. So,
well, I want to hear from Jeff. I mean, tell me, who's in your buildings? Do you have local folks working in your buildings?
Sure, we have to. You know, the entrepreneurs who maybe, you know, started Matacast Chocolate, those folks, you know, one's from Berkeley and one's from Brooklyn, but the people that are packing the chocolate bars in boxes are the people from within 3-4 blocks of the building themselves.
Okay.
And that's repetitive in all of those businesses.
So, Jonathan, your question, your point. Can we create these kinds of opportunities in parts of the city where real estate's expensive? Or can we only do it where real estate's still, where the old buildings are going up for grabs? What do you think?
Well, the kind of things that you're talking about, I think it's hard to do it where real estate is expensive. There's a price point for so many of these businesses. Like an architecture firm today is not going to, they can hardly afford Union Square anymore.
Right.
And you know, that's not to say Midtown or you know, or other Class A spaces. And so these are really important. I think the key question, and Margaret and Jeff were getting at it, is just how do you make sure that more of these things that are growing actually create jobs or connect with people in communities, because a lot of what's growing in the economy today, these kind of creative industries, tech companies, they're not necessarily accessible to, or as accessible as some of the manufacturing jobs. And meanwhile, the manufacturing jobs don't have as many employees as they once did. So these are important projects. We need to be creating jobs, period. But you know, we have to make sure that, you know, they connect more. And I want to just mention one thing. There was a, you know, this has been a problem for years, and not just with these newer type of companies. So places like Red Hook, Hunts Point, traditional manufacturing industrial centers, for years had all these problems where the companies there were not seen as hiring local people. Yeah. But I saw this great project, and I think it's too rare in New York right now do we have kind of an intermediary that has great connections to the businesses and to the local residents. And in Red Hook, there was this great little organization, the South Brooklyn LDC. They were merged with another organization now. It's a great organization still, but they had someone right in Red Hook that knew all the businesses in Red Hook, all these light manufacturers, but she also knew all the folks in Red Hook houses. And so she created just some informal system where when one of the glass blowers in Red Hook or the set designers had a job opening, she went to the tenant leaders in Red Hook houses, and where there could be a fit, she made it happen. And so I think that, you know, those are the beginnings of things that might be able to be done.
Sounds like the mesh to me. Got to find the mesh locally. We're working with some intermediaries. We work with the Brownsville Partnership in Brooklyn, and they're playing that similar kind of role in a neighborhood that's dominated by public housing, has a bunch of challenges, but is looking for different ways to connect residents with other opportunities. So let's just quickly talk about government. You talked a little bit about the kinds of initiatives you'd like to see government that you think support things. Are there particular public policy thoughts or recommendations you think we should be going towards?
Oh, man. You know, it's hard to really think of ideas that are better than direct capital. I think
money is kind of good.
Yeah, money's great. So when you think about agencies like EDC and SBS, I think that they should think about these items when they're thinking of who they give their grants to. So, you know, it's not just about creating jobs, but it's about creating jobs for, we think, the sector of the population that needs it most. So perhaps you could say, you know, we're giving away $2 million grants for incubators, but maybe that grant is $3 million if, you know, 15% of your workforce is local. Or, you know, they need more examples of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Brooklyn Navy Yard does so much job training on site. You know, that could be something that's encouraged with dollars. Yeah, I think it's just being more, because there's limited resources. That's just the world we live in today. So I think it's about being a little bit more targeted about the dollars and funds that are already being channeled into these neighborhoods and to these businesses.
What about, is there housing? Jeff, do you have housing as part of your buildings?
No, not at all. No.
And would there ever be any thinking about that, about whether you'd get what's called in Britain key worker housing? Would you ever see that being appropriate?
We would. Again, the government would have to allow me to do the zoning, because right now the projects that I have is a manufactured zone.
So some kind of more permissive zoning might allow you to consider that?
Sure. Matter of fact, they could even use some historical context to it, because if you go look around the surrounding 2 blocks, Pfizer actually built housing, you know, back 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Sure.
And so it actually is, you know, a historical context, and maybe would be an ideal situation.
Yeah. Jonathan, any other thoughts?
I have 3 ideas.
Go for it. 3 ideas.
If I can remember what they all are.
Heard it here first.
One is just the industrial business zone program. You know, the mayor. You know, before they created this system, there was a lot of uncertainty for manufacturers, and they didn't know that they could kind of put down roots in a building. Also, when you say that an area is going to remain manufacturing, it kind of takes it off the pressure from people to turn it into residential or buy it and know that they're going to turn it into residential. So you can preserve some of these buildings for the uses we're talking about. 2, since a lot of the businesses in buildings like Jeff's are smaller businesses in a variety of fields, I think that there's a role for the city to play in helping more of these small businesses get to the next level. We just did a report showing how few small businesses incorporate technology into their business. Also, a lot of these companies in New York, these niche food manufacturers, have real potential to export beyond their own community or beyond the city. Maybe not overseas, but maybe to other cities on the East Coast. If we can get more of these small businesses to grow, then they're creating more jobs. Some of them will be local. And then finally, just one specific thing, you know, the Watchtower properties in Dumbo.
Right.
A lot of them are going to be sold. When we did our tech sector report recently, one of our recommendations was, let's make sure that some of that space gets preserved for commercial use. You know, I think that a lot of people just think that it's going to be turned into high-priced housing, perhaps as a way to fund the Brooklyn Bridge Park. But look, there's so much growth. Dumbo today is absolutely full. There is no commercial space left in Dumbo, and it is so hot. Companies want to be there. So we have these watchtower buildings that are exactly the kind of buildings I said that tech companies, design companies, they want to be in. Let's make sure that at least some of that watchtower space is preserved for commercial use.
So from the from watchtowers to the Willentis. I'm trying to get my W's going. I had Viagra to vegetable. All right, so isn't it fabulous to have an enlightened financier, an enlightened developer, and an enlightened researcher with us, an activist, Jonathan, you're many things. Would you thank on our behalf this panel? Thank you, guys.